always happy to have Jennifer with me. How are you, Jennifer?
Good morning, Philip. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, wonderful. So I will ask you to introduce yourself again, Jennifer. Not everybody knows you and knows how important your thoughts are.
Sure, thanks. So I like to say that I'm a third-degree microbiologist. I have a PhD in microbiology and molecular cell sciences, subject matter expertise in respiratory viruses. So I've spent most of my career working in vaccine development and testing, mainly with influenza and other respiratory viruses. I've worked a little bit with RSV, with mumps. I managed government contract to test candidate vaccines for Ebola. Most recently, I worked as an epidemiologist at the Hawaii Department of Health, where I was on the front lines of the pandemic response, doing case investigation and contact tracing for COVID. I investigated over 700 confirmed cases of COVID. And so I'm uniquely positioned basically to talk about viruses from both the research side as well as from the public health side.
Excellent. Yes, you've always been a tremendous resource in terms of discussing the science around COVID-19, especially the microbiology, the virology, the immunology. So that's great. But tell me something before we get into it, Jennifer. You have then gone ahead to author a book. What's that about? Can you show us the title?
Sure. So yes, my book, Pandemic in Paradise, was released in November of last year, November 2022. So basically, the whole experience of the pandemic response in Hawaii starting in 2020 and going to the end of the year, I felt like with everything that had happened, both in the state, in the world, and to me personally, I felt that it was an important story to tell, and it was my story to tell. So overall, I became a whistleblower in the state of Hawaii, exposing the COVID corruption there, and was subsequently released from my position. So I think it speaks volumes when somebody with my level of education experience is then censored, sidelined, and ultimately discharged from their position when trying to share basic scientific knowledge that I have on this virus.
Yeah, and this is very strange, Jennifer, because you were involved in the early stages of SARS-CoV in Asia. To think that they would discount your expertise, your opinion, and ideas, why would that be? What? I don't know how to explain that. What is that?
I mean, I am very, I have no words, no words to explain it, honestly. I feel like I have learned a great deal over the last few years about gaslighting. Is something that I never really understood before, but I have become very, very attuned to what is gaslighting, how it feels, what it looks like. And I feel like it's been gaslighting. That's the only word I can use
Can you
for a
explain?
lot that's happened over the last few years.
Can you explain gaslighting generally so that not everybody knows the term, and then explain how it worked in your circumstance?
I mean, basically, it's, telling people what people think is true, making them believe that it's not. So, trying to undermine what is actually true and what is actually valid. And that has happened a lot. Like we can just, for example, natural immunity. People were told, oh no, you still have to get vaccinated even if you were infected and recovered. Like we've known, I mean, it's a basic tenet of immunology. Once you have had an infection, you have immunity. It's actively acquired immunity. And to tell people that, no, that's not right, that's not true, that's not a thing anymore, that is a perfect example of gaslighting. And one of the many things that people were told over the last few years that just undermined people's trust. It undermined people. It's unnerving to me, Philip. It's very unnerving to me. These people in leadership positions, the public health professionals who they preyed on people, and they used fear to manipulate I mean, it's just unnerving to me.
Mm. And when you think, I sometimes wonder because you were one of those people who ended up getting banned and censored on many platforms for challenging that. You know, one of the questions I always ask people is why didn't more people who had expertise do that? What made them not do that?
Well, I mean, people will protect themselves and their self-interests 100%. This is what happened. And I believe I've said it before, is that scientists, all of their funding comes from the federal government. It comes from NIH. It comes from these agencies. And so for them to speak out would risk losing their livelihoods. And not only that, but the people they support who work in their laboratories. So, it's better to just be a peacekeeper than a peacemaker.
Mm. Yeah, that's very difficult. And we are coming now. And I think that I think the person who would use the term is that we are having an Iraq war all over again with regards to the pandemic. That was, I think, Alex Berenson. And when he said that, one of the things that I highlight to people politically is that the issue about weapons of mass destruction was never supposed to have come out because the Iraq war was supposed to have been over in 4 weeks. We have the same thing here with the COVID-19 pandemic because all of those leadership people in leadership, scientists, thought the pandemic would be over once they got the vaccine rollout. What did they miss?
Well, I mean, the key question is, what is a pandemic? How do we define pandemic? What makes this a pandemic? And in my mind, this never was a pandemic. I know that's probably controversial, but um, and then to go along with that, what is the criteria to end a pandemic? What criteria do we use to say that this is over? With influenza, we usually think of pandemics with influenza. And if you go back to 2009, when they declared a pandemic with the 2009 H1N1 virus, the criteria they used then to end the pandemic was when the number of cases returned to seasonal levels. Okay, so that's when they said, okay, this pandemic is over. In this case, in my professional opinion, I would say, we've learned how to treat this virus infection. There are, whether good or bad, there are approved therapeutics for this virus, and there is now whether true or not, a so-called vaccine to prevent infection. Now there's a lot of caveats there, but if we just take those things and say that we have therapeutics, we have preventives, we know how to treat the virus, wouldn't that mean that this pandemic has been over?
Mm, that's interesting. And you raise a great point is that at the moment, the pandemic is over because the politicians say it's over, meaning that it's now going out in the news, the pandemic is over, don't worry about it. And I
Right.
think to myself, after people have been scared for 2.5 years, to just tell them that it is now over because it needs to be over, it doesn't work. How do you do that from an
Well, I
ethical?
think
Yeah.
I think what people need to understand when it comes to emergency response is declaration of an emergency has nothing to do with the reason behind the emergency. Okay, it has real nothing to do with the virus. Declaring an emergency at a government level means that we can sequester funds without having to pass legislative measures to use however we want to use it for. Okay, so that's what an emergency declaration does. The state can encumber funds from wherever they need to use however they want to. The federal government can take whatever funds they want and do whatever they want with them, and they don't have to pass legislative action in order to do that. So that's mainly the underpinning of an emergency declaration.
Mm.
So yeah, these emergencies should have been declared over a long time ago, and our government is continuing to rape the taxpayers um, by taking money and funding from taxpayers to do whatever they want with it.
And so the one of the things that people are getting very, very confused about is that it seems as though different countries are doing different things. Are they doing different bits of scientific research? How is that explained?
That's a good question, Philip.
Any thoughts? I mean, it is, to put it in the context, you have at one side, I mean, you still need to be vaccinated to get to the USA, for example. Yet the UK has stopped the booster vaccine doses for the 12th, that's tomorrow, is the last day that people can get it. So I guess they can't travel to the USA. But then you also have Brazil.
Actually, that's not true. They just rescinded the travel ban.
Oh, so they've now changed that.
They have
Okay.
now lifted that. Yep.
They-
Foreign
they-
travelers do not have to give their card to come to the US. Yep.
Excellent.
And I'm
Now,
not sure the date that goes into effect. Sorry, I'm
um,
not.
but you also have places like Brazil now insisting on vaccination for people who need to have, I guess, their version of benefits, and they are following the science as well. How does public health fix this?
I mean, I heard from someone who's in Borneo that they're up to 7. They're on number 7, and apparently the first 5 were mandatory to be able to like work and go shopping. Um, I do not understand. I don't understand the rationale behind any of it. I don't understand what the thought process is in terms of like what they're using to determine the requirements for those things. I really don't know.
And so let's ask you a hard question. I'm putting you on the spot now, Jennifer, because you've been involved in vaccine development for some time. What do you class what we're using as?
Well, as I have said, I would not call this a vaccine. And I've had some conversations with colleagues about this. We've come up with the term genetic vaccine, but by definition, a vaccine is something that's administered for prevention of the disease. In fact, the US Patent Office stipulates that it must induce an immune response that protects against infection and not merely any immune response. So, given that definition, these genetic vaccines just don't fit. Stimulating just any kind of immune response is not protective. And I started a Substack and I wrote just the other day about this in the FDA meeting last year. And I don't know how this hasn't come out obviously we know why it hasn't come out in the mainstream media, but the executive at Pfizer, senior vice president of Pfizer, admitted that they have no idea the mechanism of how this mRNA injections work to induce an immune response. They said they don't need to know. It's academic. They just know that it induces some antibody response, and that's all they need to know.
Wow.
That is very disturbing. I mean, this is what I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This is why it takes 10 to 12 years to develop an effective preventative, because we must study how natural infection programs the immune response, how it induces memory to prevent infection upon subsequent re-exposure. And that's why it takes time, because not every vaccine platform will work for every agent. And so you have to know, how does infection work? How does it program the immune response? What preventive measure, what platform can we use to also mimic that immune response and induce that same thing upon passive immunity?
What you're saying is just making so much sense, Jennifer. I'm trying to get my head around because our experts know this.
Yes.
So it comes back to the fundamental question as to how can so many people across the world compromise the fundamentals of their scientific training and study in the context of a pandemic? Is that fair?
Philip, one word: money.
Money.
Money. Money
Yeah.
corrupts absolutely.
Wow. Wow. And this is
That's really the only thing that I can come up with. You know,
Yeah.
the thing that bothers me the most, and I'm sure you're aware of this paper that came out about, asking for amnesty for all the things we didn't know that we did when we didn't know. And that set me off. This, we didn't know. You know, no, that is, no, we didn't know. As you said, these people who are in leadership positions, these are medical doctors, they have PhDs, they're sitting in high level government positions. Okay. You went to medical school. Okay. You know the training, the classes you took, the training you received. You know, there are certain things you have to understand, concepts of like immunology. You have to know what an infectious agent is. You have to know how it works. You have to know how the body works and how the body responds. I mean, so for them to sit there and say, oh, we didn't know, again, that is just shameful. It is obvious gaslighting. It's the most obvious gaslighting ever. If they didn't know, they should have held those positions. They would have never been put in that position if they did not know those basic tenets of their own field. They wouldn't have been put in that position, and they shouldn't have stayed in that position if they didn't know.
Yeah. And so,
That is just disarming to me. And again, as a PhD, I know this. I know the classes I took. I know the training I went to. I know the seminars I sent to, the conferences I sat in, and all of the research. This, we didn't know, is just, it's just utter gaslighting.
yeah, and this is the worrying thing is because when you look at what you were saying, because I did interview you much earlier in the pandemic, and what you were saying has been borne out. And I'm going to bring in a very interesting document here, and this is a paper that was done with, well, it was partially done with Dr. Fauci, wasn't it, here? So this is January 11, 2023, and it's rethinking next generation vaccines for coronaviruses, influenza viruses, and other respiratory viruses. David Morins, do you know who he is?
Yes.
Who is he?
He's well known in the field of influenza.
He's influenza. What about Jeffrey Talberger?
Jeffrey Taubenberger is very well known and respected in the field of influenza. He did a lot of work studying the 1918 influenza virus.
And then you have Dr. Fauci. And the fact that he's number 3, does that mean he just oversaw the paper rather than wrote it?
That would mean that he's primary funder for the work that was done, if there was any work done, and funded the paper.
Fine. So it's interesting. This paper now is effectively looking at the weaknesses with regards to injectable vaccines against pure respiratory viruses. And I'll come back to it in a second. But essentially, and correct me here if I'm wrong on this, what they are saying is that they have noticed that certain vaccines that work for smallpox, measles, mumps, rubella, in these diseases, the virus has an incubation period of about 10 days. Then there is a significant viremia where it goes into the bloodstream and then it causes disease. And so vaccines against those viruses work very well, injectable vaccines. But against respiratory, purely respiratory viruses that replicate only in the mucosa, they don't work so well. And they did criticize even the influenza vaccines in that paper. Any thoughts about what they were saying?
Well, I've said this for years. I don't call the influenza shot a vaccine either. I tell people that in my mind, it's what I call an immune booster. So you get a little bit of immunity for a short period of time during the epidemic phase of the virus, and hopefully keep people from getting more severely sick. So basically decrease the length and severity of disease. So I don't really call it a vaccine either. And I worked in that space for years and years. And I think that's why, we need annual injections, updated strains every year to protect just during that time when the virus is circulating at the highest level. So I do agree with that. my own work has borne this out as well, Philip. I don't know if we've discussed this before, but a lot of what I did was study aerosol, small droplet aerosols in terms of delivery of influenza virus for potential use as a vaccination strategy. So, we have the live attenuated influenza virus vaccine, which was administered intranasally. And it's very clear from my work that the route of administration, the route of transmission can most certainly affect the downstream programming of the immune response, but also affects the pathology from the disease.
And so, when early on, one of the things I would have been calling for was mucosal vaccines for the pandemic rather than injectable vaccines. Now,
Right.
injectables got the head start, and I think part of the problem was that they didn't have as much expertise with mucosal vaccines. What was the reason, you think, why that didn't seem and still hasn't got the same kind of support as injectables?
Well, there are certain challenges with delivering something intranasally. So what we were working with, with the MedImmune's flu mist, which is the intranasal flu vaccine, they use this, it's called AccuSpray device, which is essentially a syringe, and they squirt it up somebody's nose. But the problem is there's a lot of variation in terms of who the vaccinator is. So this is supposed to be a small droplet. It's supposed to be delivered in small droplets. You have to get up into the nasal passages, into that immune tissue that's up in the upper nasal passages, right, in order to produce that protective immunological effect. Now the problem is a lot of times, and I never took the flu mist, so I'm not sure, but the experience of most people is that if the plunger is pushed too quickly, then what you get are large droplets. They generally can drip out of the nose. Some is swallowed and gets back in the throat. So it wasn't really reaching those those necessary immune tissues in the nasal passages to provide a protective response. So it just wasn't being delivered properly, basically. So what we looked at is using nebulizer to generate consistent small particle droplets that can be inhaled and can reach those tissues in the upper nasal passages. And we showed that was highly effective in animal models. So you get a protective effect, but what's also very interesting is you can actually use what's called dose sparing. So you don't have to give as high a dose when you're delivering it that way. So you can actually vaccinate more people with less virus and get more protection. So it's all about delivery. And again, it's about real estate, like location, location, location. It's all very important in terms of vaccination.
Yeah, that's really, really important. Now, and this is where it comes back to what you said. Was this being just driven by financial considerations? Because this was blatantly obvious with the way how the virus operated. I was saying this based on the research. When you looked at the animal models with regards to SARS-CoV-2, before they even got symptoms, it was in their lungs. And so using an injectable would always be behind the virus. It would always never quite catch up to it. You had to somehow get the upper airway mucosal system to be effective. And strangely enough, this is exactly what the paper says as well. So if they knew that then, why didn't they apply it?
Well, here's the thing, Philip, that's very interesting. And, you have to look back, we stand on the shoulders of others. Okay. What that means is, I can't do all the research. I have to build on what others have done before me. Okay. So going back to SARS, the original in 2003, we had 17 years of research on SARS. Okay. So we can base our knowledge on SARS-CoV-2 on what we know from SARS. Okay, SARS-CoV-2 is SARS reemerged. It's the same virus, uses the same receptor. It behaves similarly, causes similar disease. So let's look back in the literature, okay? And it was very interesting to me, if you look back in the efforts to develop a vaccine for SARS, the original, there were distinct issues with developing a vaccine. So a paper, quite interestingly, that came out of Ralph Barrick's lab in 2015 showed that they tried live attenuated influenza or live attenuated coronavirus vaccine. They also tried double inactivated vaccine, and neither of them worked. Not only did neither of those platforms work, but they caused immune pathology. So they knew already that standard platforms for developing a vaccine against SARS were not going to work. They already knew that based on the history of research that had already been done.
And so, could that have explained why they decided to go for mRNA? Because they had already, yes, I remember looking at a paper in 2012. They tried 4 different types of injectable vaccines, and every one of them created a T helper 2 immune allergic response. And it said clearly caution when developing vaccines against this virus. So you're right, they knew this. Could this have been the reason that they went for the mRNA? Were they hoping that this technology would evade that kind of problem?
I mean, we can give them the benefit of the doubt and say, yeah, we had to try some kind of new technology to get past those barriers. The thing is, at the end of the day, Philip, not every virus is amenable to vaccination. Okay.
Mhm.
And as outlined in the Fauci paper that you brought up, and I believe I've said this before as well, there's a reason we don't vaccinate against these highly mutable RNA viruses. There's a reason that it doesn't work. And instead of spending our time and money on vaccination as the end all be all, golden, get us out of this pandemic, we should have used resources to pivot and to develop therapeutics, effective therapeutics.